How many hours was that before she was reported missing?
I really can't tell you all the time details because time gets away from you when you're trying to enjoy yourself.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at 5 clues we all missed. Today is day 35 since 5-year-old Summer Wells disappeared from Ben Hill Road in the Beach Creek community area of Tennessee near Rogersville. It's been 35 days of searching, fruitless searching, and also speculation, one might even say fruitless speculation. But gradually thoughts have been turning steadily towards foul play.
A shift in strategy now focuses on the possibility of foul play.
Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen, hit the bell to receive notifications of live streams, usually over the weekend. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the many of you who have subscribed in the last couple of days. And let's get started. So if we are taking the idea of foul play seriously, right? If we are saying that this isn't an innocent accident, it's not, and I don't even think the Wells family are suggesting that, then something else happened, something deliberate, and possibly also something that's been covered up. If that is the case, then what clues can we see that sort of add to that fabric of foul play? So I think the first and possibly the most important clue that many of us have missed is neglect. Now you might say, no, I didn't miss it, I saw it. But have you seen it fully? Have you seen the neglect in its full dimension, the full scale and scope of it, right? And neglect isn't only about parenting, and that is certainly a place where you want to start. You want to ask the question, were Summer's parents good parents? And especially Summer's mother, who was at home with her most of the time. Was she a good mother? Was she a good guardian? Was she someone who took care of this 5-year-old girl? Did she protect her from her brothers? Did she look after her, right? But that is perhaps the beginning of the question, but it's certainly not the end. You don't sort of look at it and say, okay, I think there is neglect here. You've got to look a lot further than that. And I think a intelligent way to gauge the scale of the malaise is to almost look at the parenting last, right? So you don't start there. You actually you don't even stop there either. But you basically start somewhere else. And what I think a lot of us have missed, in a sense, is just looking at neglect as an overall factor. So if you look at the house, and we've all seen photos of the outside of the house, we've seen aerial footage and so on. Does the house, and unfortunately we've mostly seen only the outside, but what does the inside look like? But in terms of the outside, it is a bit of a scrabble of outbuildings, a bit of a hodgepodge of structures, right? But between that hodgepodge is kind of a mess. There's some garbage lying around. There are things lying around. I think in the title image I've highlighted what looks like a rusted bedstand, sort of leaning against the side of the wall. There's a boat lying there, kind of thing. And it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world if you've got things lying around. I mean, my garden right now isn't looking in its best state either, right? But the difference is I'm not a parent and there's not a child that has gone missing, right? You can look at the neglect of the property in isolation and say, so what? You know, they had other things to do, but it's also just not a normal level of neglect. There's also quite a few vehicles sort of rusting all along the driveway. The garden, even though the mother was saying they were planting flowers, one doesn't really get a sense of a garden. One doesn't really get a sense of anything that is neat and tidy and tended to. There's an overall sense of neglect in terms of the property, right? Then I think the next level is looking at the animals on the property, and we can see, I have one dog. I've got one puppy, what's about 1.5 years old now, and I've had other animals come here, but it's quite a lot of work dealing with more than one animal. I've had my dog vaccinated and so on. The question is, have the Wells family vaccinated all of their animals? And I would assume not. I would assume that they have not had their shots, that they're also flea-ridden, that they are not fixed and all that sort of thing. Not just in terms of one dog, but possibly all the dogs, right? And Summer has her own puppy, but I don't know if that is really a sign of anything, beneficence kind of thing. I think it's really just goes with the territory. I don't know whether they breed with the dogs and sell the dogs. I don't really know what the situation is. But there seem to be a lot of dogs, more than is really necessary. And I don't know whether those dogs are taken care of in a way that is sort of, let's just say, standard, right? So I think the dogs extend that sense of neglect even further. In other words, the property is not really taken care of. The dogs aren't really taken as good care of as they probably should be, right? And then that brings us to the final point, which is themselves. Are they taking care of themselves? Is Don taking care of himself? Is Candace taking care of herself? Is Candace's mother taking care of herself? And then the next thing is, well, how? How are they taking care of themselves? And we've heard the stories about CPS being summoned there numerous times, right? And besides that, when we look at their appearance, when you see Donald appearing wherever, he's actually still got paint spattered on his clothing. And even in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's on camera, when he's sitting beside Candace on camera, there's actually some paint on the side of his face. I don't know if you guys have noticed. And you might think, wow, that's so unfair. You're really judging them harshly, right? But if you take Chris Watts, for example, he was an oil worker. Now, when he came back from the oil side, was he covered in oil? And in a weird way, you would almost expect him to be. Expect some oil spatter on him. But there's none of that. So I think one can sort of take it further and say, in a situation where a child has gone missing for 35 days now, is neglect a factor? And in any case where a child goes missing, neglect is a factor. It doesn't matter what the level of privilege is or not. It was a factor in the Madeleine McCann case, and I've just put up a video that took me the whole day yesterday to cobble together. It's a factor in all sorts of missing persons cases. It was a factor in the Casey Anthony case and so on. I'm not going to stress that anymore, just to say that neglect is a factor. And is it a factor here? It certainly appears to be. It certainly appears to be a serious factor. And that is why I say we need to revisit it and take a look at it in various dimensions. When we go into the next thing, which is addiction, you can see that there's a possible hand-holding between the first and the second, and they reinforce one another. Addicts tend to be neglectful of themselves, of other people, of people close to them, of the things that need urgent attention, right? And there almost seems to be a celebration from Candace that she enjoys a sort of hillbilly lifestyle, right? But the question is, just like with neglect, these substances that she was using, was it just binging? Was it just enjoying them? Was she in control? or was she an addict? And I think when you deal with the fact that there was this possibility of intoxication on a weekday with a minor, then one starts to wonder, okay, what scale are we talking about here? And also, was it limited to alcohol, or was there something else there? We've had that conversation already, right? But I think in the same way that you might say, wow, it's so unfair that how you are judging these people. But in a situation, can you imagine if television cameras came to interview you? Would you not make an effort to dress appropriately, to perhaps have a bath, perhaps cut your hair or whatever, wash your face in preparation for that interview? I would. I certainly, when I do a live, I prepare, I make sure my teeth are brushed and so on, and I do a little bit of grooming. If you're about to go into national television, aren't you going to be concerned about your appearance, especially when you know people are going to judge you? You know people are going to be wondering, are you responsible for what has happened? Aren't you going to want to put your best foot forward? And so if when you are kind of on the chopping block, you still can't really put your best foot forward, that raises some questions. And on this question of addiction, when we see Candace slurring and slow and sort of sleepy during the Sermon on the Mount, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. I thought, wow, this person really doesn't seem to have much of a range of emotion, which is why I went to watch what the behavior panel said, and I just didn't agree with what they said. But when Alison Harris, who knows her, who knows the baseline, who knows Candace probably sober and not sober, when she said, wow, she seemed high as a kite, that meant something to me. And if when you're on camera, when you're going to finally break your silence, you are on a substance apparently as well, that is certainly worrying. It seems to show that the scale of it is pretty severe. And if that's true, if you have someone who is either very frequently, very regularly using certain kind of substances, then isn't it an addiction? And if there's this substance used on the day someone goes missing, and then also when you go on camera to talk about it, one wonders, when aren't you on these substances? And again, the addiction brings into perspective the scale and scope of the neglect, doesn't it? And I don't want to say ordinarily, but let's just say ordinarily, if someone is practicing these sorts of habits regularly, it may not be the end of the world if you don't have children, or if your children are, let's say, older. But if you've got a 5-year-old that one needs to look after and one needs to check on, then it could be a serious problem. And wasn't it? Hasn't it been? And then from the addiction side, we go to secrets. Now, I'm the first person to say what I'm talking about here, these 5 clues, they aren't rocket science, but they are, in a weird way, so obvious that you might dismiss each of them and say, yes, I'm sure there was a bit of neglect and maybe she was addicted. The question is how much, and how did these things fit into the mosaic of what actually happened? That is what one's got to look at long and hard, and with facts and information and knowing the dynamics, right? And we start to get a sense of, we've already got a sense of how neglect and addiction can work together, right? How they can kind of complement one another in a dangerous way. But when we come down to the next level, secrets and keeping secrets, we can see that there's something that there is a bit of a darkness around this case. And again, this isn't news to you guys. I'm sure you know this. But the question is, the disappearance of Rosemary Bly, what actually happened there? And is a secret being kept? Is it just that we don't know, she disappeared without a trace and we don't know? Or is someone keeping a secret?
About how many hours was that before she was reported missing?
You know, I really can't tell you all the time details because time gets away from you when you're trying to enjoy yourself.
Before she was reported missing.
You know, I really can't tell you all the time details because
So the important part to stress there is Candace saying, I really can't tell you. She's saying, I can't tell you the time details, but she's also saying, I really can't tell you. I'm not going to tell you what the time details are. And, you know, she doesn't need to provide like second by second or minute by minute, but she's left huge holes there. And, you know, there could be two reasons for it. The one could be because she's done something wrong. The other one could be because she was so intoxicated that she can't remember the details. And that may be true for the incident itself. But I don't know whether that would apply to whatever followed, because we know that she drove from the swimming hole home, right? And she probably was capable of driving after that, after she got home, or even, you know, before she got home. She certainly was capable of contacting 911. But just returning to the broad strokes, what secrets could we be talking about? Well, there could be secrets regarding Rosemary Bly. Whether she was involved or not, she might not want to really talk about it. And when she was asked about her whereabouts in the Sermon on the Mount, what did she say?
when my sister went missing, I was in between Arkansas and Tennessee. I don't know all of what happened or what did happen.
So when you listen to those words, I don't know what happened. I don't know all of what happened or what did happen. And that's regarding her sister, who's been missing for 12 years. She's now on national television. It's a chance to sort of address that, and that is very close to where the interview terminates. It's within a minute from the end of the interview that question is asked, and one can almost imagine the reporter thinking, well, I'll leave this question for last because it's probably, or I don't know if it's probably, but it might make these people uncomfortable, and didn't it? In the Chris Watts case, the question about the pregnancy was left until last, and that was really the last question when that interview terminated, right? So the question is, are secrets being kept about Rosemary Bly? And based on this interview, where Candace says, you know, I don't really know anything, she doesn't know anything about time as well, the critical stuff, she doesn't seem to know anything. And so the question is, are there secrets, and are secrets being kept? Now, I can tell you, anyone who's an addict is keeping secrets. They're keeping secrets about the scale and scope of what they're doing, how regularly they're doing something, how much they're doing whatever, how much it's costing, all the things that aren't happening that should be happening. There's a lot of that sort of thing going on, secrets and keeping secrets when you're doing that sort of thing. And things like neglect that flow out of that, whether it's your schoolwork or your homework or your housework, that tends to be not, it might be, you might say it's a little white lie, but it just means you get very habituated, you get very used to, you get very familiar with lying about little things constantly. Another secret that I think is hard to steer away from is Macbeth. What is the nature of that relationship? What is the nature of that friendship? What is the nature of what happened at the swimming hole? What substances were consumed by whom? What else happened there? There's also the CPS visits. How many were there? What did that involve? Why were the boys sent to sleep upstairs and Summer downstairs? And then the criminal records, which Don doesn't want to talk about. You know, we've heard him say that. And so isn't that another secret? Isn't that another secret aspect to this family? It's not just secrets, it's keeping secrets.
I've had, several charges over the years. I used to have, I don't know if I should elaborate on any of that.
And so that brings us to the fourth dimension of these obvious clues that I think we're missing. Not so much the clues themselves, but the way that they connect to one another and the scale of them, the intensity of them, and the way that they sort of knit together, right? and that is covering up. Is there a scenario of covering up for one another? So look at where we've come from. Neglect holding hands possibly with addiction, addiction holding hands with keeping secrets about the addiction and about the neglect, and then what makes the whole, the neglect and the addiction and the secrets kind of come together is covering it up, is basically telling stories and coming up with versions of events to in a narrative sense, wash away your own past, your own activities, and also actions that have taken place, also incidents that are not good. And it's easy to be sober and speak soberly about these things and say, I don't really want to talk about it, but what if you could interview some of these people when they weren't sober? What would they say then? What did Candace say to her mother about her sister when she wasn't sober? And so the question is, and this is something for the authorities to determine, accurately and, with as much detail as possible, what has been covered up besides this over the years, what has been covered up? To what extent has there been covering up? And I suspect that there's been a lot of covering up just as a matter of course, just as a matter of generally covering up, right? Covering up a lifestyle. And Facebook and social media is certainly a way to do that. And one thing that I haven't really dealt with in this episode in a lot of detail is, what about the social media coming into neglect? In other words, you are on social media all the time, and that is playing into the neglect. You're trying to assert some kind of personality, some kind of persona, some kind of identity to some kind of target audience. On Facebook, you're trying to sort of, do some posturing, perhaps flirting on social media, on Facebook. Does that play into a mother's neglect? If you are addicted to certain substances, can you also be addicted to social media? And then does that play a factor as well? And then we've also seen things that have been posted on social media disappear and filtered out. This is something we often see in true crime. And because there is so much social media, there is really so much to work with in a sense, and it hasn't stopped. Donald and Candace have been posting quite a lot. Donald sort of talking about Christian folk and prayers and forgiveness. Is that covering over certain sins? And, we've also got to look at the CPS. Was that covered up? Have there been CPS visits that are important, that have a bearing on what happened to Summer ultimately? Was what happened to Summer an accident waiting to happen? And in terms of the CPS reports, I think we've got to ask the question that Loki asked.
What more than that?
Now, before we get to the fifth and final aspect of this particular episode, I want to highlight something that Donald said at 2.5 minutes into the Sermon on the Mount. Let's listen in.
Well, I knew right away that she was abducted.
Now, when you listen to Donald Wells, he seems to speak a lot more than Candace does, but there he says, we knew, and then he says, I knew immediately, corrects himself to say, I knew immediately. Now, he wasn't even there. He was, I guess, at work. So how on earth could he know immediately? Not only did he know immediately, Candace also knew immediately. She sort of went downstairs and her daughter was gone, and suddenly she knew immediately. But there's nothing happened. There was no dogs barking, no sound of a vehicle. There wasn't even a length of time she knew immediately. The other things that he talks about is her body weight and her little hands and things like that. All of that seems to suggest a kind of intimate knowledge that one wonders whether he would otherwise have had in terms of what he's talking about here, right? Then, and that brings us to the final point. I'm going to end off on this. The final clue that we've all missed is the grandma's silence. And I actually got a real sense of this from Pat Brown, the criminal profiler. She did a live the other day, and she was just saying, and it's so true, that Candy has been through all of this before, right? She's been through 12 years of her one daughter going missing, and she's got nothing to say about it, right? So you've got this sermon happening on the Mount, and she's right there. Doesn't she have anything to say to the media either? She's been brought in on the 10-year anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. And so she's appeared on TV before. Doesn't she want to say something now? Doesn't she want to say anything? And does she say nothing because she's got nothing to say? Or is there another reason why she says nothing? And so what I want to just highlight here is that the covering up may be something that's second nature. The keeping of secrets may be something that is second nature. The neglect may be something that is not second nature, but something that has become all too familiar, along with the addiction as well. So I'm not going to take it further than that. In the next episode, we'll be talking a little bit more about grandma's silence. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.